Hey everyone. Most people believe that love is a wonderful feeling, signifying the union between two people who feel as one. However, for others, love becomes an obsession, giving rise to a manic desire to possess the other person. The signs include insecure and jealous individuals whose relationships are filled with resentment. They become obsessed with the person they desire and stalk them either physically or through other means. Today, I will analyze this obsessive nature in Pearl from Steven Universe. Examining her character more closely reveals key flaws that keep her in a mental captivity, the self-destructive nature of her passion for Pink Diamond. But before continuing, I think you know what I'm going to say. If you could, subscribe would really help, and I already thank you for being part of this journey. Pearl knew many of Rose's secrets, and her devotion was completely intertwined with Rose's influence. This was evident throughout the show. Pearl's desire for independence and freedom often reflected Rose's own desires and will, rather than seeming like Pearl's own wishes. One of the primary instances of Pearl's obsessive nature towards Rose can be found in the episode, Sworn to the Sword. This strong devotion to Rose shines so brightly that one of the most important lines in the episode is when Garnet describes Pearl's great attachment. Her long-standing behavior towards Rose was of total devotion, and not only does Garnet's testimony support this, but also her emotional state towards Steven and Connie in the same episode. This outburst clearly suggests that she has a history of difficult conversations with Rose about Pearl putting herself in danger too often. Steven's father, Greg, further expands on this romantic aspect of Pearl's obsession. The song that Pearl sings, "It's Over, Isn't It?" is just her lamenting the fact that Rose fell in love with Greg and not her, which she personally admits to Greg later in the episode. The pain of losing Rose's interest to a human she barely knew, combined with the pain of knowing that Rose was gone forever, made it so difficult to bear that she clung to the memories of her beloved to make her life easier. The most important episode on this theme is A Single Pale Rose. This episode provides context for certain behaviors we see Pearl exhibit later in her life. Her devotion to Diamond is literally tied to her reasoning, but how Diamond treats her, more as an equal than the servant she was created to be. This only fueled Pearl's adoration for her Diamond. This adoration is what drives Pearl to help Rose Quartz fake her shattering, fight against the Gem homeworld, and stand by her side after the war. Despite all the trauma she suffered because of Rose, she still mourns the loss of her Diamond, the first person who made her feel important. All of Pearl's inspiration is Rose, and her devotion is entirely rooted in Rose's influence. This becomes increasingly evident when we see flashbacks of their relationship in the series. In a reflection of the previous seasons, Pearl's desire for independence is usually just an extension of Rose's desires and wishes. It goes to the extent that Pearl repeats Rose's words to herself in a rehearsed manner. This probably stems not only from Pearl's affection for Rose, but also from being born into a society of slavery and brainwashing. As a result, I feel that Pearl had more difficulty adjusting to the pressures and freedoms of life on Earth, at least when compared to Garnet and Amethyst. Garnet personified the freedom that Rose desired for the gems, and while she mourns Rose's death as a friend, her identity is not defined by Rose, as we see when Sapphire and Ruby are able to reflect and unite. Amethyst, being younger, never knew the oppression of the Gem homeworld, therefore, she can only understand from an external perspective what Pearl, Garnet, and Rose experienced as gems who escaped an oppressive society to find refuge on Earth. Losing Rose, although painful, is not nearly the same for Amethyst and Garnet as it is for Pearl. While Garnet and Amethyst are dealing with the loss of a close friend and family member, Pearl is coping with the loss of her reason for being. Sure, Pearl was free under Rose, but she maintained her status as a servant or slave to Rose. Unlike Rubies or Sapphires, whose roles had their own levels and advancements within the system of oppression, the existence of Pearls was purely for the convenience and pleasure of other gems. These underlying pressures are what really drew me to the character. Even before we learned all these details about Pearl's character, it was clear to me that this kind of story was intentional and would come out at some point. Pearl always seemed to take Rose's death harder than the others, and it never seemed to me that the only reason for this was unrequited love. I think a very revealing scene that conveys this feeling is when Pearl encounters Lion for the first time and ends up fleeing. In the scene where she finds Lion, she is emotionally destroyed by the idea that something about Rose was hidden because she was supposed to know everything about Rose, and this seemed to betray the idea of Rose trusting Pearl. Pearl's outburst of grief says a lot about her trauma and relationship with Rose. Amethyst gets upset but doesn't follow through, probably not understanding the depth of Pearl's pain. Meanwhile, Garnet remained silent during Pearl's outburst, likely understanding that Pearl suffered much more as a gem of significantly lower status when they lived in the gem homeworld. However, without knowing that Pearl was Rose's pearl, a diamond's pearl, the full extent of Pearl's suffering was hidden. In the minutes following the outburst, we see how Pearl's character is a form of devotion to the path chosen by Rose, rather than an independent choice or path that Pearl developed on her own. Pearl joined the rebellion after hearing about other gems who desired freedom, but it had been just Rose's idea, and Pearl was merely following her. Amethyst again cannot understand the difference in how Pearl perceives the loss. Garnet, while empathetic towards Pearl, understands that there is a difference in the feeling of loss. There is an experience she cannot fully grasp because, unlike Pearl, Garnet was truly free from the diamonds and their dictatorship, while Pearl still lived directly under one and kept that diamond secret. This is why Garnet remained much more grounded in reality than Pearl. When Garnet was born, she accepted that Rose was gone, while Pearl could not stop grieving. They are at very different stages in the grieving process. Sometimes this can even make it seem like Garnet is a bit colder towards Pearl, though not necessarily from the audience's perspective, as viewers have seen Rose's death for a long time. From a gem's perspective, only a few months or days have passed since Rose's loss. Remember that Pearl was with Rose for over 5,000 years. So 10 or 20 years with Steven is an incredibly short period for what is essentially an immortal life. Additionally, during those 5,000 years, Pearl never fully explored her freedom because she lived alongside Rose, adhering to the boundaries Rose set. A scene that highlights this idea that Pearl was never truly free until Rose's death comes in Season 2, Episode 9, where Rose and Pearl fuse. Rose, as a diamond and leader, seems to unintentionally exploit Pearl. Fusion is a deeply personal experience for gems, and in the gem world, it is highly regulated. As Garnet, Sapphire, and Ruby have shown, fusion is not to be taken lightly. Even though Pearl and Rose may have fused, it is Rose who is using Pearl to entertain Greg, while Pearl is trying to demonstrate the strength of their relationship and push Greg away. When they separate, Rose's focus is entirely on Greg, leaving Pearl clearly jealous and unhappy, trying to tell Greg that he will never be as close to Rose as she was. I noticed that it isn't until Steven begins to enter adolescence that Pearl really starts to assert herself as a separate, independent being. She likely isn't as dependent on Steven for care anymore. The episode, Back to the Barn, is a great example of this, as we learn about Pearl's life as a gem servant and see her asserting herself and rediscovering her identity after losing Rose and realizing that Steven won't rely on her forever. This journey Pearl undergoes, reflecting on her pain, allows her to overcome trauma and attempt to deal with a secret trauma without anyone knowing. This aspect makes Pearl's story particularly interesting from a character, narrative, and perspective. Pearl must first overcome her grief and then find a new definition of identity based on her own purposes, needs, and desires. Pearl is probably not fully healed, as she's much older and it hasn't been that long since these events. But at the very least, she is free from her restraints and trying to cope with her pain. Thank you for taking the time to discuss this.